The ocean doesn't care if you want to live. Caleb Ward learned that on day 7, when the salt crusted so thick on his lips they cracked and bled into his mouth. The life raft spun in lazy circles under a merciless sun, and somewhere beneath the waves, sharks had been following him since dawn. He could see their shadows, patient, circling, waiting for him to slip. His hands were raw from gripping the rope. His vision blurred at the edges. And when he finally saw the island rising like a dark tooth from the horizon, he didn't feel relief. He felt rage. Rage that he'd have to fight just a little longer. Rage that the ocean hadn't finished him yet. He paddled with blistered palms until the raft scraped sand, then collapsed face first into the surf. The island saved him. And then it tried to kill him. If you want to know how a broken soldier and a woman who should have been dead survived an enemy invasion, a collapsing jungle, and each other, stay with me until the end. Drop a like, comment what city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story can go. Caleb didn't move for a long time. He lay half submerged in the shallows, tasting salt and sand, feeling the water pull at his legs like it wanted him back. His body screamed at him to stay down, to let go, to sleep. But somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the exhaustion and the hunger and the weeks of horror, a small, savage voice said, "Not yet." He dragged himself forward. Inch by inch, he crawled up the beach until the wet sand turned dry and hot beneath his palms. His uniform was in tatters. His dog tags clinked softly against his collarbone. He rolled onto his back and stared up at the sky, gasping, his chest heaving like a broken engine. The sky was too blue. Impossibly blue. Like the war had never happened. But it had. Caleb closed his eyes and saw it again. The deck of the USS Langford exploding in a fountain of fire and twisted metal. Men screaming. The ocean swallowing them whole. He'd been blown overboard in the blast, his ears ringing so loud he couldn't hear himself scream. By the time he surfaced, the ship was already sinking, dragging hundreds of souls down with it. He'd clung to a piece of debris, then found the raft floating among the wreckage. 7 other men had been with him at first. One by one, they'd died. Dehydration, exposure, madness. The last one, a kid from Ohio named Petty, had slipped into the water on day 5 without a word. Caleb had tried to grab him, but Petty's eyes were already empty, and the ocean took him gently, like a mother tucking in a child. After that, Caleb stopped counting days. He opened his eyes. The jungle loomed ahead, dense and dark and alive with sound. Birds shrieked. Insects buzzed. Somewhere deeper in, something large moved through the underbrush with a heavy, deliberate tread. Caleb's throat was so dry it felt like swallowing glass, but he forced himself to sit up. His head swam. His vision doubled, then snapped back into focus. Water. He needed water. He stumbled to his feet, swaying, and walked toward the tree line. The sand gave way to rough coral rock, then to soft earth carpeted in dead leaves. The temperature dropped 10 degrees the moment he stepped under the canopy. The air was thick, humid, buzzing with life. Vines hung like ropes from the branches above, roots twisted across the ground like veins. Caleb moved slowly, listening. His training kicked in despite the fog in his head. Watch the shadows, check your 6. Don't assume you're alone. He'd been a Marine raider before the Langford, trained for reconnaissance, sabotage, survival. But no amount of training prepared you for this. Stumbling half dead through an uncharted jungle with no weapon, no map, no backup. He found the stream 20 minutes later. It was shallow, no wider than his arm span, trickling over smooth stones. Caleb dropped to his knees and plunged his face into the water. He drank until his stomach cramped, then drank more. The coolness spread through him like a drug. He sat back on his heels, gasping, water dripping from his chin. For the first time in a week, he didn't feel like dying. He rinsed his face, his arms, the back of his neck. Then he filled his canteen, still miraculously clipped to his belt, and stood. The jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, a maze of green and shadow. No trails, no landmarks, just chaos. But Caleb had survived worse. He started walking. Tuts. The village appeared like a ghost. Caleb almost missed it. The structures were so overgrown with vines and moss that they blended into the jungle itself. Huts made of wood and thatch, arranged in a rough circle around a central clearing. Some had collapsed entirely. Others leaned at sickening angles, their roofs caved in. The whole place had the feel of something abandoned in a hurry, tools left scattered, cooking pots overturned, a child's toy half buried in mud. Caleb moved cautiously into the clearing, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm that wasn't there anymore. The silence was wrong. Not quiet, silent. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustle of wind through the leaves. He stepped over a broken fence and approached the nearest hut. The door hung crooked on leather hinges. He pushed it open slowly, wincing as it creaked. Inside was darkness and the smell of rot. He waited for his eyes to adjust, then stepped in. Empty. A sleeping mat, torn and moldy. A clay pot, cracked. A wooden shelf that had collapsed under its own weight. He turned to leave and froze. Someone was watching him. He felt it before he saw anything. That prickle at the base of the skull, the animal instinct that screams danger. He spun toward the doorway, fists raised, and saw her. She stood just outside the hut, framed in the pale light filtering through the canopy. A woman, mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. Her clothes were simple, worn canvas pants, a faded shirt with the sleeves rolled up, boots caked in dried mud. But it was her eyes that stopped him, sharp, steady, unafraid. She held a machete in one hand, the blade resting casually against her thigh. Neither of them moved. Caleb's heart hammered in his chest. His mouth was dry again. He forced himself to speak. "I'm not here to hurt you." His voice came out rough, cracked from disuse. The woman didn't respond. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Caleb raised his hand slowly, palms out. "I'm American. U.S. Marines. My ship went down a week ago. I've been drifting. I just need water, food. I'll leave if—" "You won't leave." Her voice cut through his rambling like a knife. Calm. Certain. American accent, though faint, like she hadn't spoken English in a while. Caleb blinked. "What?" "You won't leave," she repeated, "because there's nowhere to go." She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a doctor might study a patient. "You look half dead. When did you eat last?" "I don't—" Caleb's voice faltered. He tried to remember. 4 days. Maybe 5. The woman sighed, lowering the machete. "Follow me, and don't touch anything." She turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Caleb stood there for a moment, stunned, then hurried after her. Her name was Mara Elridge. She told him that much as she led him deeper into the jungle, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every root and vine by heart. Caleb stumbled behind her, his legs shaking with exhaustion, but he didn't complain. He was too busy trying to process what was happening. There was another person here, a survivor. "How long have you been on this island?" he asked, ducking under a low-hanging branch. 2 years, Mara said without looking back. "Give or take." 2 years? Caleb's mind reeled. Why didn't you signal for help?" "I did. No one came." Her tone was flat, matter-of-fact, like she was describing the weather. They emerged into a smaller clearing, and Caleb stopped short. In the center was a shelter, crude but functional, built from salvaged wood and palm fronds. A fire pit sat nearby, ringed with stones. Drying racks held strips of fish and what looked like wild fruit. A tarp stretched between 2 trees created a makeshift rainwater collector, feeding into a row of glass bottles. It was a camp, a home. Mara gestured toward a log near the fire. "Sit." Caleb obeyed, too tired to argue. She disappeared into the shelter and returned with a wooden bowl filled with something that smelled like heaven, fish stew, thick with chunks of root vegetables. "Eat slowly," she said, handing it to him, "or you'll throw up." He took the bowl with shaking hands and forced himself to eat in small bites, even though every instinct screamed at him to devour it. The stew was bland, no salt, no seasoning, but it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Mara sat across from him, sharpening her machete with a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape filled the silence. "What happened to your ship?" she asked after a while. Caleb swallowed. "Torpedoed. Japanese submarine. We didn't even see it coming." She nodded slowly. And you're the only one who made it? As far as I know. Another silence. What about you? Caleb asked. How'd you end up here? Mara paused, the whetstone hovering over the blade. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. I was a nurse, she said finally. Working at a field hospital in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded. Things got bad fast. Evacuations, bombings, chaos. I was supposed to be on a transport ship heading to Australia, but… She shrugged. Wrong place, wrong time. The ship got hit before we even left the harbor. I grabbed a lifeboat with a few others and we drifted for days, eventually washed up here. The others? Caleb asked quietly. Mara's jaw tightened. Dead. Infection. Fever. One drowned trying to swim for help. She resumed sharpening the machete. I buried them all. Caleb stared at her, at the hard set of her shoulders, the distant look in her eyes. She wasn't just surviving, she was enduring. There was a difference. I'm sorry, he said. Mara shrugged again. It's war. People die. She said it like a mantra, like she'd said it 1,000 times before. Caleb finished the stew in silence, then set the bowl aside. His body felt heavy, anchored by exhaustion, but his mind was racing. So what now? He asked. We just… wait? Mara looked up at him, her expression unreadable. We survive. That's all there is. Someone has to come eventually. Patrols, supply runs. They won't, Mara interrupted. This island is off every map. No strategic value, no resources, just jungle and rock. No one's coming, Caleb. The way she said his name, like she'd already accepted him as part of the island, sent a chill down his spine. Then we build a raft, he said. Signal fires, something. Mara smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. You think I haven't tried? I spent 6 months building a raft, lashed it together with vines, waterproofed it with tree sap, launched it on a calm day. She paused. It broke apart 3 miles offshore. Current pulled it under. I barely made it back. Caleb's stomach sank. You're stuck here, Mara said softly. Same as me. The sooner you accept that, the easier it gets. But Caleb shook his head. No, I didn't survive a week on the ocean just to give up now. Mara studied him for a long moment, then stood. Get some rest. You look like death. She walked toward the shelter, then paused in the doorway and glanced back. And Caleb? Don't wander off alone. The jungle doesn't forgive mistakes. Then she disappeared inside, leaving him alone by the dying fire. Caleb didn't sleep. He tried. He lay on the ground near the fire pit, staring up at the canopy, but his mind wouldn't stop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Langford sinking, heard the screams, felt the water closing over his head. So he sat up and fed the fire instead. The jungle came alive at night. Frogs croaked in overlapping rhythms. Something howled in the distance, high and eerie, like a child crying. Caleb's skin crawled, but he forced himself to stay calm. Just animals, he told himself. Nothing out here wants to eat you, probably. He glanced toward Mara's shelter. A faint glow flickered inside. Candlelight, maybe, or a small lamp. She was awake too. What kind of person survives 2 years alone on an island and doesn't go insane? Caleb wasn't sure he wanted to know. He poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral up into the darkness. His body ached, his hands were blistered, his ribs hurt every time he breathed. But beneath the pain was something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. He wasn't going to die here. He refused. And if Mara had given up on rescue, fine. That just meant he'd have to do it himself. He'd build a better raft, a stronger one. He'd study the currents, wait for the right wind. A twig snapped. Caleb's head whipped toward the sound, his muscles coiling. The firelight didn't reach far, maybe 10 feet before the darkness swallowed everything. But he could see movement, shadows shifting between the trees. He stood slowly, his pulse quickening. Mara? He called softly. No answer. Another sound. Closer this time. A low rustling, deliberate and heavy. Caleb's hand closed around the stick he'd been using to prod the fire. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The rustling stopped. Caleb's breath came shallow and fast. He scanned the tree line, every nerve screaming, "Where are you?" And then he saw them, eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the firelight, low to the ground, watching. Caleb's blood turned to ice. Wild dogs. No, feral dogs. He could see their shapes now, lean and hunched, moving in a slow semicircle around the camp. Their ribs showed through matted fur. Their teeth glinted when they panted. They weren't just curious. They were hunting. Caleb took a step back toward the fire. "Mara!" he shouted. "Mara!" The shelter door slammed open, and Mara appeared, machete in hand. She took one look at the pack and swore under her breath. "Stay close to the fire," she barked. "Don't run." "I wasn't planning on it," Caleb shot back, his voice shaking. The dogs crept closer, their growls rising like distant thunder. There had to be 15, maybe 20 of them. Too many. Mara moved to his side, her blade raised. "They come at night sometimes. Usually they stay in the deep jungle, but if they're desperate enough..." "What do we do?" "We make ourselves bigger than them." She raised her arms, the machete flashing, and let out a guttural roar that echoed through the clearing. Caleb joined her, shouting, waving the burning stick. The flames crackled and spat. For a moment, the pack hesitated. Then the largest dog, a scarred brute with one blind eye, lunged. Mara moved like lightning. She sidestepped, swung the machete in a brutal arc, and caught the dog across the shoulder. It yelped and tumbled sideways, blood spraying. The rest of the pack scattered, snarling, but didn't retreat far. "They'll try again," Mara said, breathing hard. "We need to hold them off until dawn." Caleb grabbed another branch from the fire, his hands trembling. "This is insane." "Welcome to the island." The dogs circled, eyes gleaming, waiting for their moment. And Caleb realized with sickening clarity, this was just the beginning. The night stretched on forever. Caleb's arms burned from holding the flaming branch aloft, but he didn't lower it. Couldn't. Every time the flames dipped, the dogs crept closer, their eyes reflecting the firelight like tiny coins. Mara stood beside him, her machete slick with blood from the first attack, her breathing steady despite the tension coiled in every muscle. "How long until dawn?" Caleb asked through gritted teeth. Mara glanced at the sky, barely visible through the canopy. 3 hours, maybe 4. "Christ, keep the fire fed," she said. "They won't come through the flames if we keep it bright enough." Caleb grabbed another piece of deadwood from the pile near the pit and tossed it into the blaze. Sparks erupted upward, and the dogs flinched back, snarling. But they didn't leave. They just paced the perimeter, waiting. "Why don't they give up?" Caleb muttered. "Because they're starving," Mara said. "Same as everything else on this island. The war scared off most of the game. What's left is too smart to get caught. So the dogs turned scavenger." She paused. "And when there's nothing left to scavenge, they turn predator." Caleb swallowed hard. "You've dealt with this before." "Twice. Lost part of my rainwater collector the first time. They tore through the tarp looking for food." She adjusted her grip on the machete. "The second time, they killed a wild pig I'd trapped. Dragged it into the jungle before I could stop them." "What'd you do?" Mara smiled grimly. "Set traps, hunted 3 of them down. Hung the carcasses at the edge of camp as a warning." She glanced at him. "It worked. For a while." Caleb stared at her, trying to reconcile the calm, methodical woman beside him with the image of someone stalking feral dogs through the jungle and stringing up their bodies like trophies. He wasn't sure if he was impressed or terrified. Maybe both. The pack's leader, the scarred brute with the blind eye, circled closer, its lips pulled back to reveal yellowed fangs. It growled low and deep, a sound that vibrated in Caleb's chest. "That one's testing us," Mara said quietly. "If it thinks we're weak, it'll charge. The rest will follow." "So what do we do?" "We show it we're not weak." Before Caleb could respond, Mara stepped forward, raising the machete high above her head. She screamed, a raw, primal sound that cut through the jungle like a blade. The dog froze, ears flattening. Mara took another step, and another, slashing the machete through the air with enough force to make it whistle. The dog backed up. Then it turned and bolted into the trees, the rest of the pack scattering after it. Silence fell over the clearing like a curtain. Caleb exhaled shakily, lowering the branch. His hands were trembling. That actually worked." Mara turned back to him, her expression unreadable. Fear is a language. You just have to speak it loud enough. She walked back to the fire and sat down heavily, wiping the blade on her pant leg. Caleb joined her, his legs suddenly weak. He dropped the branch and sank onto the log, his head in his hands. You okay? Mara asked after a moment. Caleb laughed bitterly. Define okay. Still breathing, not bleeding, that's the standard here. He looked up at her. How do you do it? How do you just keep going? Mara was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard before. Because the alternative is giving up. And I've seen what that looks like. She glanced at him. You have too. Caleb thought of Petty, slipping into the water without a fight. He nodded slowly. You survived out there for a reason, Mara continued. Maybe you don't know what it is yet, but you will. Caleb wanted to believe her. He really did. But sitting there in the dark, surrounded by jungle that wanted him dead, it was hard to see past the next sunrise. Still, he nodded again. Get some sleep, Mara said, standing. I'll take first watch. You sure? I'm sure. You look like you're about to collapse. Caleb didn't argue. He stretched out on the ground near the fire, using his rolled-up jacket as a pillow. The earth was hard and unforgiving, but exhaustion dragged him under within minutes. He dreamed of drowning. Okay. When Caleb woke, the sun was already high, slicing through the canopy in golden shafts. Birds called to each other in overlapping songs. The fire had burned down to embers, and Mara was gone. He sat up quickly, his heart lurching. Mara? No answer. He stood, scanning the clearing. Her machete was missing. So was the small canvas pack she kept near the shelter. Panic flared in his chest. Had she left? Abandoned him? Then he saw the note. It was scratched into the dirt near the fire pit with a stick. Gone fishing. Back by noon. Don't wander. Caleb exhaled, relief flooding through him. She hadn't left. She was just hunting. He glanced around the camp, taking it in properly for the first time. In daylight, it was even more impressive. The shelter was reinforced with saplings lashed together with vines. The rainwater collector had been cleverly angled to catch runoff from multiple directions. Drying racks held not just fish, but strips of what looked like wild boar, cured and salted. A small garden plot near the edge of the clearing grew cassava and taro. Mara hadn't just survived here, she'd thrived. Caleb walked to the edge of the clearing and stared into the jungle. Somewhere out there, she was moving through the trees with the same confidence she'd shown last night. Fearless, unstoppable. He envied her. But more than that, he wanted to learn from her. Mara returned just after noon, as promised, carrying a string of fish and a cloth sack bulging with something lumpy. She looked surprised to see Caleb sitting by the fire, waiting. You didn't wander, she said, dropping the fish onto the drying rack. You told me not to. She raised an eyebrow. Most men don't listen. I'm not most men. Mara smirked faintly. We'll see. She opened the sack and pulled out several large coconuts, along with a handful of strange, spiky fruit Caleb didn't recognize. She tossed one to him. Durian, she said. Smells like death. Tastes like heaven. Don't eat too much or you'll regret it. Caleb turned the fruit over in his hands, wrinkling his nose at the pungent odor. This is food? It's calories. That's all that matters. She was right. Caleb cracked it open with a rock and forced himself to eat. The taste was rich, almost custardy, but the smell made his eyes water. Still, his stomach growled with appreciation. They ate in silence for a while, the jungle humming around them. Finally, Caleb spoke. Teach me. Mara looked up. Teach you what? Everything. How to fish, how to hunt, how to move through the jungle without getting killed. He met her gaze. You've been doing this for 2 years. I've been here 2 days. If I'm going to survive, I need to learn. Mara studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. Okay, but you do exactly what I say when I say it. No questions, no arguments. Understood? Understood. Good. She stood and grabbed her machete. Lesson 1. Never trust the jungle. It'll kill you the second you let your guard down. The lessons began that afternoon. Mara led him to the stream where he'd first found water, then showed him how to read the current, how to spot the shallow pools where fish like to gather. She taught him to make a spear from a straight sapling, sharpening the tip with her machete and hardening it over the fire. "Patience," she said, as Caleb jabbed uselessly at the water, scattering fish in every direction. "You're not fighting them. You're outsmarting them." "Easy for you to say," Caleb muttered. "It wasn't easy for me either. I spent 3 weeks starving before I caught my first fish." She crouched beside him, her voice quieter. "But I learned. And so will you." It took another hour, but Caleb finally managed to spear a small fish. It wasn't much, barely longer than his hand, but the rush of triumph was overwhelming. He whooped, holding it up like a trophy. Mara smiled. A real smile this time, not the guarded half expressions she usually wore. "Not bad," she said, "for a beginner." Over the following days, the lessons continued. Mara taught him how to set snares for wild game, how to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, how to navigate by the sun and stars. She showed him how to move quietly through the jungle, stepping on roots instead of leaves, using the terrain to mask his presence. "Everything here wants to kill you," she said one morning as they crouched near a game trail. "The animals, the plants, even the weather. Your job is to be smarter, faster, and meaner than all of it." Caleb absorbed every word, every lesson, storing them away like ammunition. His body grew stronger, his hands toughened, the blisters healed into calluses. He stopped flinching at every sound in the jungle and started listening instead, learning to distinguish the call of a hornbill from the warning cry of a monkey. And slowly, something shifted between him and Mara. They talked more, shared stories. Caleb told her about growing up in Montana, about joining the Marines to escape a father who drank too much and a town too small to breathe in. Mara told him about nursing school in Chicago, about volunteering for the Red Cross when the war broke out because she wanted to help, to matter. "I thought I'd save lives," she said one night as they sat by the fire. "That's what nurses do, right? But all I did was watch people die, over and over, and there was nothing I could do to stop it." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he just listened. "This island," Mara continued, staring into the flames, "it's hell. But at least here, when someone dies, it's not because of orders or politics or some general's strategy. It's just survival. There's a clarity to that." Caleb understood. Out here, the rules were simple. Eat or starve, fight or die. No moral ambiguity, no question of whether you were on the right side. Just life and death. And for a man who'd spent months killing people he'd never met for reasons he didn't fully understand, that clarity was almost a relief. Massa. 3 weeks passed. Caleb had grown lean and hard, his body adapting to the relentless demands of the island. He could spear fish with reasonable accuracy now, set snares that actually caught something, and move through the jungle without snapping every twig under his boots. Mara still outpaced him in every way, but the gap was closing. They fell into a rhythm. Wake at dawn. Check the traps. Fish or hunt depending on what the island offered. Repair the shelter, collect water, prepare food, sleep, repeat. It was brutal, exhausting work. But Caleb found himself not happy, exactly, but something close, purposeful, alive in a way he hadn't felt since before the war. And then the planes came. Caleb heard them before he saw them, a distant drone that grew louder by the second. He was hauling water back to camp when the sound reached him, and he froze, his heart hammering. Aircraft. He dropped the bottles and sprinted toward the clearing. "Mara! Mara!" She burst out of the shelter, machete in hand, her eyes wide. "What?" "Planes." They both looked up just as the first one roared overhead, low enough that Caleb could see the red circle painted on its wings. Japanese. "Get down!" Mara screamed, tackling him into the dirt. The world exploded. The first bomb hit the far side of the island, the concussion so powerful it knocked the air from Caleb's lungs. The second hit closer, shredding trees and sending a geyser of earth skyward. The third struck the abandoned village, obliterating what was left of the huts in a fireball. Caleb covered his head as debris rained down, chunks of wood, burning thatch, shredded leaves. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Mara grabbed his arm and hauled him upright. "Move! Now!" They ran. Caleb didn't know where they were going, didn't care. He just followed Mara as she plunged into the jungle, weaving between trees, leaping over roots. Behind them, the bombs kept falling, turning the island into a hellscape. They reached a rocky outcrop and ducked into a shallow cave just as another explosion tore through the canopy. The shockwave slammed into the cave mouth, filling it with dust and smoke. Caleb coughed, his eyes streaming, his ears ringing so loud he couldn't hear Mara shouting beside him. Then, as suddenly as it started, the bombing stopped. The planes banked away, their engines fading into the distance. Caleb and Mara sat in the cave, gasping, covered in dirt and ash. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Why?" Caleb finally croaked. "Why bomb an empty island?" Mara's face was pale, her jaw tight. "It's not empty anymore, shut." They waited in the cave until the sun began to set, too terrified to move. When they finally crept back toward camp, Caleb's stomach sank. The clearing was gone. Not damaged. Gone. A bomb had landed directly on the shelter, leaving nothing but a smoking crater. The rainwater collector was shredded. The drying racks were kindling. The fire pit was buried under a mound of scorched earth. Everything they'd built, everything they'd worked for, destroyed. Mara stood at the edge of the crater, staring down into it. Her face was blank, her hands clenched into fists. "Mara, don't," she said quietly. "Just don't." Caleb didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He just stood beside her as the light faded and the jungle filled with the sounds of night. After a long silence, Mara turned to him. "We need to move, tonight." "Why?" "Because they're not done." She pointed toward the coast where a faint orange glow lit the sky. "That's a beach landing, troops, equipment. They're occupying the island." Caleb's blood turned to ice. "How many?" "Enough." Mara grabbed what little remained of their supplies, a half-empty canteen, the machete, a salvaged fishing net. "We go deeper into the jungle. Find somewhere they won't look." "And then what?" Mara met his eyes, and for the first time he saw fear there. Real, naked fear. "Then we pray they don't find us," and set. They moved through the jungle like ghosts, staying off the trails, avoiding clearings. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the canopy so thick it blotted out the stars. Strange sounds echoed around them, hoots, shrieks, the distant crack of gunfire from the beach. Caleb's nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Every shadow looked like a soldier. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. But Mara kept moving, her focus absolute. They walked for hours. Finally, just before dawn, Mara stopped at the entrance to a narrow gorge. Water trickled down the rock face, pooling at the bottom. A thick wall of vines hung like a curtain across the opening. "Here," she said. Caleb looked around. The gorge was hidden, defensible, and had fresh water. It wasn't much, but it was something. They pushed through the vines and collapsed inside, their bodies too exhausted to go any further. Caleb lay on his back, staring up at the sliver of sky visible through the gorge. His mind raced. Enemy soldiers, bombs, occupation. They'd gone from survivors to fugitives overnight. "Mara?" he said quietly. "Yeah?" "We're not getting off this island, are we?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely a whisper. "No, probably not." Caleb closed his eyes, and for the first time since washing ashore, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Despair. But beneath the despair, buried deep, was something else. Something Mara had put there with her lessons, her resilience, her refusal to quit, a tiny, stubborn ember of defiance. They weren't dead yet, and as long as they were breathing, they could fight. The gorge became their prison and their sanctuary. For 3 days, Caleb and Mara huddled in the narrow space, barely moving, barely speaking. They rationed the water that trickled down the rock face, drinking only when their mouths were too dry to swallow. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, but they didn't dare venture out to hunt. Not yet. Not while enemy patrols combed the jungle looking for exactly what they were: survivors. Caleb could hear them sometimes, distant voices barking orders in Japanese, the crunch of boots on undergrowth, the metallic click of rifles being cocked. Once, a patrol passed so close to the gorge that Caleb could smell cigarette smoke drifting through the vines. He'd held his breath until his lungs screamed, certain they'd been discovered. But the soldiers moved on. On the fourth day, the patrols grew less frequent. The enemy had apparently decided the deep jungle was empty, or at least not worth the effort. Caleb and Mara finally allowed themselves to breathe. "We can't stay here forever," Caleb said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like a taut wire. Mara sat against the rock wall, her knees drawn up to her chest. She looked thinner than she had a week ago, her cheekbones sharper, her eyes sunken. "I know. We need food, real food, and we need to figure out what they're doing down there." "Reconnaissance," Mara said flatly. "You want to scout the enemy." "I want to know what we're up against." Caleb met her gaze. "If they're just passing through, we wait them out. If they're building a base, we need a plan." Mara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but we go together, and we go at night." "Agreed." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the jungle filled with the chorus of nocturnal creatures, they slipped out of the gorge and began the long, careful descent toward the coast. "What?" The jungle at night was a different animal entirely. Every sound was amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Caleb moved slowly, placing each foot with deliberate care, following Mara's lead. She navigated by instinct, her body language so attuned to the environment that she seemed to flow between the trees like water. They stayed off the trails, moving through the thickest undergrowth where visibility was near zero, but tracks were impossible to follow. Thorns tore at Caleb's clothes, insects crawled over his skin. Twice, he nearly stepped on snakes coiled in the leaf litter, jerking back just in time. But they kept moving. After what felt like hours, Mara raised a hand, signaling him to stop. She crouched low, and Caleb did the same, his heart pounding. Through the trees ahead, he could see light, lots of it. They crawled forward on their bellies until they reached the edge of a ridge overlooking the beach. Caleb's breath caught. Below them, the enemy had transformed the coastline into a military outpost. Prefabricated shelters lined the sand in neat rows, their canvas roofs glowing from lanterns inside. Supply crates were stacked in towering piles near the waterline, guarded by soldiers with rifles. A radio mast had been erected near the center of the camp, its antenna reaching skyward like a skeletal finger. But what made Caleb's stomach drop were the artillery emplacements. 3 of them, positioned along the high ground overlooking the bay. Coastal guns, each one capable of tearing apart a warship. They were being assembled now, crews working by lamplight to bolt the massive barrels into place. "They're fortifying," Mara whispered beside him. "This isn't temporary." Caleb counted the soldiers he could see. 20, maybe 30. Hard to tell in the dark, but there were probably more in the shelters, sleeping in shifts. "How many do you think?" he asked quietly. 50, maybe 60. Mara's jaw tightened. "Enough to hold this island against a small assault." "Why here? This place has no strategic value." "It does now." Mara pointed toward the bay. "Look at the water. Deep harbor, natural shelter from storms. If they control this island, they control the shipping lanes around it. Any Allied vessels trying to pass through become target practice for those guns." Caleb swore under his breath. She was right. The island wasn't valuable on its own, but its position was. It was a choke point, a dagger pointed at the throat of any fleet trying to navigate these waters. And if the Americans didn't know it was occupied, ships would sail right into the kill zone. "We have to do something," Caleb said. Mara turned to him, her eyes hard. "Like what? There's 2 of us and 60 of them. We don't have weapons, we don't have supplies, and we sure as hell don't have backup." "Then we sabotage them. Hit the supplies. Damage the guns. Make them think the island isn't worth holding." "That's suicide. Sitting in that gorge waiting to starve is suicide too." Caleb's voice was urgent now, the desperation he'd been holding back spilling out. "At least this way we go down fighting. At least we do something." Mara stared at him for a long, tense moment. Then she looked back at the camp below, her expression unreadable. "Even if we wanted to," she said slowly, "we'd need weapons, food, a way to move without being seen." "The village," Caleb said suddenly. What's left of it? There might be supplies buried in the rubble, tools, maybe even explosives if we're lucky. That's a long shot. It's the only shot we have. Mara exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging. You're insane. You know that? Probably. Despite everything, a faint smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Fine. We go back to the village, see what we can salvage. But if we don't find anything useful, we retreat. Agreed? Agreed. They crawled backward from the ridge, slipping into the jungle's embrace, and began the long trek back. The bombed-out village was even worse than Caleb remembered. The structures had been reduced to skeletal frames, charred wood jutting up from the earth like broken bones. Craters pocked the ground where explosives had landed. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, acrid and bitter. They approached cautiously, scanning for signs of patrols. The enemy had apparently written off the village as thoroughly destroyed because no guards were posted. That was their first stroke of luck. Mara led Caleb to the largest hut, or what was left of it. This was the headman's home, she said quietly. If there's anything worth finding, it'll be here. They began digging through the debris, working quickly and silently. Caleb's hands were soon filthy, his fingernails caked with ash and dirt. He found broken pottery, a rusted machete with no handle, a child's wooden toy scorched black by fire. Then his fingers brushed something solid. He pulled it free, a metal box, dented but intact, buried under a collapsed beam. His pulse quickened. Mara. She was at his side in an instant. Together they pried open the lid. Inside were tools, a hammer, a hatchet with a chipped blade, a coil of wire, a small handsaw, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a Japanese field knife with a 6-inch blade. Caleb lifted the knife, feeling its weight. It wasn't much, but it was a weapon, a real one. Jackpot, Mara breathed. They kept digging. Over the next hour, they unearthed more. A fishing net tangled but usable, a canvas tarp, 2 glass bottles that could hold water, and tucked inside a hollowed-out log, a canvas bag containing 3 sticks of dynamite. Caleb stared at the explosives, his mind racing. Where the hell did these come from? Mining operation, Mara said. The villagers were clearing land for a new well before the war. They must have stored the leftovers. Are they still good? Mara examined the sticks carefully, sniffing them, checking for deterioration. Hard to say. Dynamite goes unstable over time. These could blow perfectly, or they could misfire and take our hands off. So we use them carefully. Very carefully. They loaded everything into the tarp, fashioning it into a makeshift pack, and slipped back into the jungle before the sun rose. The gorge felt almost like home when they returned, though it was nothing more than cold stone and dripping water. Caleb and Mara laid out their haul, taking inventory. 3 sticks of dynamite, 1 knife, basic tools, Mara said, her tone clinical. Not exactly an arsenal. It's enough to cause problems, Caleb said. We hit them where it hurts. The supply depot. If we can destroy their food and ammunition, they'll have to call for resupply. That means ships, and ships mean our Navy might spot them. Mara frowned. You're assuming our side is even looking. They have to be. After what happened to my ship, they'll be sweeping the area for survivors. Or they wrote you off as dead and moved on. Caleb's jaw tightened. Then we make enough noise that they can't ignore us. Mara studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. Say we blow the supply depot. That gets their attention. Then what? They'll tear the island apart looking for whoever did it. Then we stay hidden, move camp every night, hit them again when they let their guard down. Guerrilla warfare. Exactly. Mara leaned back against the rock wall, her eyes distant. I've spent 2 years trying to stay invisible, and you want to paint a target on our backs. I spent 2 years following orders that got good men killed, Caleb shot back. For once, I want to fight on my own terms. For something that matters. Mara looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. Not agreement exactly, but understanding. You really think we can pull this off? She asked quietly. I think we have to try. She was silent for a long time. Then she extended her hand. Okay, Marine, let's go to war. Caleb shook it, and in that moment something passed between them. A pact. A promise. They were in this together now, for better or worse. Whatever came next, they'd face it side by side. They spent the next 2 days planning. Mara sketched a rough map of the camp in the dirt, marking the positions of the supply depot, the artillery emplacements, the guard rotations she'd observed. Caleb studied it obsessively, memorizing every detail. The depot is here, Mara said, pointing. Farthest from the main shelters, closest to the tree line. Makes sense. They don't want explosives near the troops. How many guards? 2 at night, sometimes 3. They rotate every 4 hours. And the fence? Wooden posts, barbed wire? Nothing we can't get through with the wire cutters. Caleb nodded, his mind working through the logistics. We go in just after midnight, when the guards are tired. Plant the charges, set a long fuse, and get out before it blows. And if something goes wrong, then we improvise. Mara snorted. That's not a plan. It's all we've got. They also worked on their equipment. Caleb sharpened the knife on a flat stone until the edge could split a hair. Mara tested the dynamite fuses, cutting them to precise lengths and waterproofing them with tree sap. They practiced moving together in silence, communicating with hand signals, syncing their movements until they could navigate the jungle as one unit. On the 3rd night, they were ready. The moon was a thin crescent, offering just enough light to see by, but not enough to be seen. Caleb and Mara moved like shadows through the jungle, their faces smeared with mud to kill the shine of their skin. Caleb carried the dynamite in a satchel slung over his shoulder. Mara had the knife tucked into her belt and the wire cutters in hand. They reached the perimeter of the camp just after midnight, crouching in the undergrowth at the edge of the tree line. Caleb could see the supply depot clearly now, a large wooden structure surrounded by coils of barbed wire. 2 guards stood near the entrance, rifles slung over their shoulders, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. Mara tapped Caleb's arm and pointed to the right, a gap in the fence, partially hidden by a supply crate. They could slip through there if they were fast. Caleb nodded. They waited until the guards turned their backs, then moved. Caleb went first, crawling on his belly through the wet grass, his heart hammering so hard he was sure the guards could hear it. He reached the fence, slipped through the gap, and pressed himself against the side of the depot. Mara followed seconds later, her movements fluid and precise. They were in. The depot loomed above them, a hulking silhouette against the night sky. Caleb could smell oil and gunpowder, could hear the faint creak of the wooden walls shifting in the breeze. He pulled out the first stick of dynamite, his hands trembling slightly. Mara steadied him with a look. You've got this. He placed the charge at the base of the structure, wedging it between 2 support beams. Then the second. Then the third, each one carefully positioned to maximize the blast. Mara lit the fuses with a match, the tiny flame flaring bright in the darkness. The fuses hissed to life, sparks crawling slowly down the waxed cords. 10 minutes. They had 10 minutes to get clear. Caleb turned to go and froze. One of the guards was walking toward them, his rifle unslung now, his eyes scanning the shadows. He shouted something in Japanese, raising the weapon. Mara moved without thinking. She lunged forward, the knife flashing in her hand, and drove it into the guard's throat before he could fire. He made a wet, choking sound and collapsed, blood pooling black on the ground. The second guard spun toward them, his rifle coming up. Caleb tackled him, slamming him into the dirt. They grappled, rolling, the guard's hands clawing at Caleb's face. Caleb grabbed a rock and brought it down hard, once, twice, until the man went limp beneath him. Silence. Caleb looked up, gasping, his hands slick with blood. Mara was staring at the dead guard at her feet, her face pale, the knife still gripped in her shaking hand. Mara, we need to go, she whispered. Now. They ran. Behind them, the fuses burned closer and closer to the dynamite, sparks hissing in the dark. They were halfway back to the tree line when the world exploded. The blast was deafening, a roar that seemed to tear the air itself apart. A fireball erupted from the supply depot, climbing skyward in a column of flame and smoke. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition cooked off, bullets cracking in every direction like lethal fireworks. Caleb and Mara threw themselves into the jungle, sprinting through the undergrowth as shouts erupted from the camp behind them. Sirens wailed. Soldiers scrambled from their shelters, shouting orders, firing blindly into the darkness. But Caleb and Mara were already gone, swallowed by the jungle, their lungs burning, their hearts pounding. They didn't stop running until they reached the gorge. Only then did they collapse, gasping, their bodies shaking with adrenaline. Caleb looked at Mara, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Mara started laughing. It was a wild, breathless sound, edged with hysteria. Caleb joined her, the tension breaking like a dam, and they laughed until tears streamed down their faces. "We did it," Caleb said between gasps. "We actually did it." Mara wiped her eyes, her grin fierce and unrestrained. "Yeah, we did." But as the laughter faded, reality set in. They'd struck a blow against the enemy, yes. They'd proven they could fight back. But they'd also just declared war. And now the island would become a hunting ground, with them as the prey. The hunt began at dawn. Caleb woke to the sound of dogs barking in the distance, their voices sharp and frenzied. He jerked upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. Beside him, Mara was already awake, her eyes fixed on the jungle canopy above. "They brought trackers," she said quietly. Caleb's stomach clenched. "How long do we have?" "Depends on how good they are. If they pick up our trail from last night..." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Hours, maybe less. They gathered their meager supplies in silence, working with practiced efficiency. The gorge had been a good hiding place, but it was also a dead end. If the enemy found them here, they'd be trapped. "We move north," Mara said, slinging the makeshift pack over her shoulder. "There's a river about 2 miles in. If we can reach it, we cross and double back. The water will kill our scent." Caleb nodded. "Lead the way." They left the gorge behind and plunged deeper into the jungle, moving as fast as the terrain allowed. The undergrowth here was thick, almost impenetrable in places, forcing them to hack through with the hatchet. Every swing of the blade sent a jolt of pain through Caleb's blistered hands, but he didn't slow down. Behind them, the barking grew louder. "They're gaining," Caleb said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I know." Mara's voice was tight. "Keep moving." They pushed through a wall of ferns and emerged onto a game trail, narrow but clear. Mara hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing the risk. Trails were faster, but they were also where patrols would search first. The barking echoed again, closer now. "Screw it," Mara muttered and broke into a run. Caleb followed, his boots pounding against the packed earth. The jungle blurred around them, a chaotic mess of green and brown. Branches whipped at his face. Roots tried to trip him. His lungs burned with every breath. They ran for what felt like miles, the trail twisting and turning until finally Caleb heard it. The rush of water ahead. They burst out of the tree line onto the bank of a fast-moving river, its surface churning white over submerged rocks. It was wider than Caleb had expected, maybe 30 feet across, the current strong enough to make crossing dangerous. Mara didn't hesitate. She waded in, gasping as the icy water hit her legs, and started across. Caleb followed, the cold shocking the air from his lungs. The current pulled at him, threatening to sweep him downstream, but he dug his boots into the rocky riverbed and pushed forward. Halfway across, he heard shouting behind them. He risked a glance back and saw them, soldiers emerging from the jungle, at least a dozen, their rifles raised. The dogs strained at their leashes, barking furiously. "Down!" Mara screamed. Caleb dropped into the water just as gunfire erupted. Bullets zipped overhead, some splashing into the river around him. He stayed low, half swimming, half crawling, until his hands found the opposite bank. Mara grabbed his collar and hauled him up onto the mud. They scrambled into the jungle on the far side just as another volley of shots tore through the foliage behind them. "Keep going!" Mara shouted. They ran. The soldiers would have to find a way across the river, which bought them time. But not much. Caleb's mind raced as they plunged deeper into the wilderness. They couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, exhaustion would catch them, or the enemy would get lucky. They needed a plan. They found shelter in a hollow beneath the roots of an enormous banyan tree, its trunk so wide that 3 men couldn't have wrapped their arms around it. The roots formed a natural cave, hidden from view and just large enough for both of them to squeeze inside. Mara collapsed against the curved wall, her chest heaving. Her clothes were soaked, her hair plastered to her face. Caleb was in no better shape. His legs felt like lead, and his hands shook from adrenaline. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, listening to the jungle, waiting for the sound of pursuit. It never came. After an hour, Mara finally broke the silence. "They'll search the riverbank. When they don't find us, they'll assume we kept moving downstream." "Good," Caleb said. "Let them waste their time." "But we can't stay here long. The jungle gets thinner to the north, less cover. So we go back south, circle around behind them." Mara looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "You want to go toward the camp?" "They'll never expect it. They think we're running away, not doubling back." Caleb leaned forward, his voice urgent. "We hit them again, while they're spread out searching for us. Take out one of those artillery guns." "With what? We're out of explosives." "Then we improvise." Caleb pulled the knife from his belt, turning it over in his hands. "We sabotage it, jam the firing mechanism, destroy the ammunition." Mara shook her head slowly. "That's insane, even for you." "Maybe, but we've already proven we can hit them and get away. If we keep the pressure on, make them paranoid, they'll pull back, call for reinforcements, and when those reinforcements show up, our Navy might intercept them," Mara finished, her eyes narrowing. "You're gambling that someone's paying attention." "I'm gambling that we're still worth saving." Mara stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she laughed bitterly. "You know what the worst part is? I'm actually starting to think you might be right." "So you're in?" She exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm in. But we do this smart. No heroics, no martyrdom. We hit them fast, we hit them hard, and we disappear before they know what happened." "Agreed." They spent the rest of the day hidden beneath the banyan tree, rationing the little food they had left and waiting for nightfall. Caleb used the time to clean and sharpen the knife, while Mara wove snares from vines, setting them around the perimeter as early warning systems. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the jungle filled with shadow, Caleb felt a familiar weight settle over him. The same weight he'd carried before every mission in the Marines. Fear and anticipation mixed together, sharpened into a blade. He was going back into combat, and this time there was no platoon at his back, no air support, no medic waiting to patch him up if things went wrong. Just Mara. And that, somehow, felt like enough. They moved through the night jungle like ghosts, retracing their steps toward the coast. Caleb's senses were on high alert, every sound magnified, every shadow a potential threat. But the patrols had thinned out, most of the soldiers still searching the northern quadrant where they thought the saboteurs had fled. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the camp, it was well past midnight. Caleb and Mara crawled to the edge and looked down. The camp was quieter than before, but still very much occupied. The supply depot they destroyed had been reduced to a blackened crater, debris still smoldering. Soldiers moved between the shelters in pairs, their movements tense and vigilant. But the artillery emplacements were still there, 3 massive guns pointed out toward the bay. "There," Mara whispered, pointing to the nearest one. "That's our target." Caleb studied the position. The gun was surrounded by sandbags and positioned on a raised platform. 2 soldiers stood guard, but they looked tired, their postures slack. The rest of the crew was probably sleeping nearby. "How do we disable it?" Caleb asked. "Breach mechanism," Mara said. "It's the part that seals the back of the barrel when the gun fires. If we damage it, the gun becomes useless. Could even blow up if they try to fire it." "You know artillery?" "I dated a gunner for 6 months before the war. He wouldn't shut up about it." She smiled faintly. "Never thought I'd actually use that information." Caleb shook his head in disbelief. "Okay, so we sneak in, wreck the breach, and get out. Assuming we can get past the guards." "Leave that to me." They descended from the ridge, moving slowly and deliberately. The jungle gave way to scrubland, then to open beach. They had to cross 50 yards of exposed ground to reach the emplacement. Caleb went first, crawling on his belly through the sand. The rough grain scraped against his skin, getting into his clothes, his mouth, his eyes. But he kept moving, inch by inch, until he reached the shadow of the sandbags. Mara joined him moments later, her breathing shallow. The guards were 20 feet away, talking in low voices. One lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face. Young, barely older than the kid Petty, who'd slipped into the ocean all those weeks ago. Caleb pushed the thought away and focused. He circled around the emplacement, moving silently until he was directly behind the gun. The breech mechanism was exactly where Mara had described it, a complex assembly of levers and seals. He didn't know exactly how it worked, but he didn't need to. He just needed to break it. He pulled the knife and wedged the blade into the seam where two metal plates joined. Then he twisted, hard. Metal groaned softly. He twisted again, and something inside snapped with a muted crack. One of the guards turned, frowning. "Did you hear something?" Caleb froze, the knife still buried in the mechanism. The guard took a step closer, his rifle coming up. "Hey, who's there?" Mara appeared out of nowhere, moving like a shadow. She drove the hatchet into the side of the guard's skull before he could shout. He dropped without a sound. The second guard spun toward her, fumbling with his rifle. Caleb lunged from behind the gun and tackled him. They hit the sand hard, grappling, the guard's hands clawing at Caleb's throat. Caleb brought the knife up and drove it into the man's chest, once, twice, until the struggling stopped. Silence fell. Caleb rolled off the body, gasping, his hands slick with blood. Mara stood over the first guard, her face pale in the moonlight. "We need to move," she said quietly. "Now." But before they could, a shout rang out from the camp. Someone had seen the bodies. Alarm bells began to ring. "Run!" Mara screamed. They bolted toward the tree line as the camp erupted behind them. Floodlights snapped on, sweeping the beach. Gunfire crackled, bullets kicking up sand around their feet. Caleb ran harder than he'd ever run in his life, his lungs screaming, his legs pumping. They hit the jungle and dove into the undergrowth just as a hail of bullets shredded the foliage behind them. But they didn't stop. They kept running, deeper and deeper, until the camp's lights were nothing but a distant glow. They didn't make it back to the banyan tree. They collapsed miles away, in a thicket so dense it was almost suffocating, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Caleb lay on his back, staring up at the canopy, his chest heaving. His hands were covered in blood. His clothes were torn. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. But they were alive. "2 guns left," he said between gasps. Mara turned her head to look at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I'm dead serious. We hit them twice. We can do it again." "Caleb, we barely made it out of there. But we did make it." He sat up, his voice fierce. "We're winning, Mara. They're scared. They're looking over their shoulders, and we're going to keep hitting them until they break." Mara stared at him, then shook her head slowly. "You're crazy. Completely, utterly crazy." "Maybe. But you're still here." She didn't have an answer for that. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the jungle breathe around them. Finally, Mara spoke, her voice quiet. "I killed someone tonight." Caleb looked at her. She was staring at her hands, still gripping the hatchet. "I know," he said gently. "I've never done that before. I've watched people die, held their hands while they slipped away. But I've never—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. Caleb moved closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did what you had to do, to survive, to protect us." "Does it ever get easier?" she asked, her eyes glistening. Caleb thought about all the men he'd killed in the war, all the faces he couldn't forget. "No," he said honestly. "It doesn't, and that's how you know you're still human." Mara closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Caleb didn't try to stop them. He just sat with her, a steady presence in the darkness. After a long while, she wiped her face and straightened. "Okay," she said. "Okay, we keep going. But we need food first. Real food. We're running on empty." "Agreed. Tomorrow, we hunt." "And after that?" Caleb's jaw set with determination. "After that, we finish what we started, Asim." The next 3 days were a blur of survival and strategy. They hunted wild pig using snares and patience, finally catching a young boar that provided enough meat for a week if they smoked it properly. They found a new hiding place in a cave system near the center of the island, far from both the coast and the areas they knew were being patrolled, and they planned their next strike. The remaining 2 artillery guns were more heavily guarded now, the enemy clearly on edge after losing the first one. But Caleb and Mara had learned to be patient, to watch and wait for patterns, for weaknesses. They spent hours observing the camp from different vantage points, noting when the guards changed shifts, when patrols passed by, when the crew slept. Mara sketched everything in the dirt, her strategic mind piecing together a plan. "The second gun is too exposed," she said, pointing at her crude map. "But the third one, here, near the rocks, the guards are lazy. They think no one will come from that direction because the approach is too steep." "So we climb," Caleb said. "So we climb." They spent the afternoon preparing. Caleb fashioned crude climbing tools from salvaged metal and wood, while Mara tested rope made from woven vines. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold their weight. As night fell, they moved into position. The climb was brutal. The cliff face was slick with moisture. The handholds treacherous. Caleb's arms burned as he pulled himself up, his fingers slipping more than once. Below him, the ocean crashed against the rocks, hungry and waiting. But he kept climbing. Mara was right behind him, her movements sure and steady despite the danger. When they finally hauled themselves over the top, they lay flat on the rocky ground, gasping. The artillery gun was 30 yards away, silhouetted against the night sky. 2 guards stood nearby, but they were facing the camp, not the cliff. Caleb and Mara crept forward, staying low to the ground. The wind carried voices from the camp, laughter and conversation in a language Caleb didn't understand. They reached the gun. Caleb went to work on the breech mechanism while Mara kept watch. This time he worked faster, more confidently, wedging the knife into critical joints and prying them apart. Metal groaned softly as components bent and broke. He was almost done when Mara hissed a warning. One of the guards was walking toward them, his flashlight beam sweeping the rocks. Caleb pressed himself flat against the sandbags, his heart hammering. The beam passed inches from his face, then moved on. The guard stopped directly on the other side of the gun. Caleb could hear him breathing, could smell cigarette smoke. The guard said something in Japanese, probably calling out to his partner. Then, to Caleb's horror, the guard stepped around the gun. Their eyes met. For a frozen second, neither moved. Then the guard opened his mouth to shout. Mara's hatchet caught him in the throat. He dropped gurgling, the flashlight spinning across the ground. The second guard spun toward them, reaching for his rifle. Caleb was on him in an instant, driving the knife up under his ribs. The man's eyes went wide, then glassy, and he collapsed. "Go!" Mara hissed. They ran to the cliff edge and threw themselves over, rappelling down the crude rope as fast as they dared. Behind them, shouts erupted as the bodies were discovered. But by the time the soldiers reached the cliff, Caleb and Mara were already at the bottom, sprinting along the shoreline, swallowed by the darkness. 2 guns down, 1 to go. But the island had become a powder keg. Patrols doubled. Floodlights stayed on all night. The enemy was furious, desperate to find the ghosts sabotaging their operation. Caleb and Mara moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. They slept in shifts, ate on the move, communicated in whispers. The strain was beginning to show. Mara's hand shook when she thought Caleb wasn't looking. Caleb's nightmares grew worse, images of drowning men and exploding ships blending with fresh memories of blood and violence. But neither of them talked about giving up. They'd come too far. On the 7th night after the supply depot explosion, as they huddled in yet another temporary shelter, Caleb spoke. "One more," he said quietly. "One more gun, and we're done." Mara nodded, too exhausted to argue. "After that, we find a way off this island, or we die trying." "Sounds about right," Mara said with a bitter smile. But before they could plan their final strike, the sky itself changed. In the distance, out over the ocean, thunder rolled. Not storm thunder, artillery. And then they saw them, flashes of light on the horizon, like distant lightning. The sounds reached them seconds later, the deep boom of naval guns exchanging fire. Caleb's heart leaped into his throat. "That's a fleet engagement." Mara scrambled to her feet, staring out at the horizon. "American? Has to be. The Japanese wouldn't shell their own position." Hope, desperate and fierce, surged through Caleb's chest. The Navy had found them, or at least found the enemy occupation. But hope was a dangerous thing, because it meant the final battle was about to begin. The naval battle raged through the night like a storm made of iron and fire. Caleb and Mara stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the horizon erupt in flashes of orange and white. The sound came in waves, delayed by distance, a continuous rolling thunder that shook the air itself. Warships traded salvos in the darkness, their guns painting the sky with tracers and explosions. "How close are they?" Mara asked, her voice barely audible over the distant bombardment. Caleb squinted at the flashes, trying to estimate. 5 miles. Maybe 6. Close enough that if those coastal guns open fire, they'll tear our ships apart, Mara finished. They looked at each other, the same realization hitting them simultaneously. The remaining artillery gun wasn't just a target anymore. It was a loaded weapon pointed at the fleet that had finally come to liberate the island. "We have to take it out," Caleb said. "Tonight, right now. The camp will be on full alert. Every soldier down there will be awake, armed, ready." "I know. This is suicide." "I know that too." Caleb turned to face her fully, his expression grim. "But if we don't do this, American sailors are going to die, hundreds of them, and this island stays in enemy hands." Mara stared at him for a long moment, the reflected light of distant explosions dancing across her face. Then she reached down and picked up the hatchet, testing its weight in her hand. "Then I guess we'd better make it count," she said quietly. They gathered what little remained of their supplies: the knife, the hatchet, a length of rope, a cloth soaked in lamp oil they'd stolen weeks ago, saved for exactly this moment. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. As they moved toward the camp, the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if sensing the violence about to unfold. They reached the ridge overlooking the beach just as the enemy coastal gun roared to life. The sound was apocalyptic, a crack of thunder that seemed to split the world in half. The massive barrel recoiled, spitting fire and smoke, and seconds later an explosion bloomed on the distant horizon. One of the American ships had been hit. "We're out of time," Mara said urgently. Caleb's mind raced, calculating angles and distances. The gun crew was working frantically to reload, soldiers hauling ammunition from a nearby bunker. Guards ringed the emplacement, at least 20 of them, all on high alert. There was no way to sneak in, no clever approach, no time for patience. This was going to be a straight fight. "Mara," Caleb said, turning to her, "I need you to trust me." She met his eyes. "I do. When I give the signal, you run for that bunker, set it on fire. The ammunition will cook off, and in the chaos, you'll go for the gun," she finished. "Caleb, you'll be completely exposed." "I know, but one of us has to reach it, and you're faster than me." He gripped her shoulder. "If I don't make it—" "Don't," Mara interrupted, her voice fierce. "Don't you dare. We both make it, or neither of us does. Understood?" Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to tell her to save herself if it came to that, but he saw the determination in her eyes and knew she wouldn't listen anyway, so he just nodded. They moved into position, circling around to the eastern approach where the rocks provided the most cover. The coastal gun fired again, the muzzle flash temporarily blinding. Another hit on the American fleet. Caleb's jaw clenched. Every second they delayed, more sailors died. He pulled the oil-soaked cloth from his pack and handed it to Mara along with a match. "Ready?" She took them, her hand steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Ready." Caleb stood, exposed himself on the ridge, and screamed at the top of his lungs. Every head in the camp snapped toward him. For a frozen instant, nobody moved. Then chaos erupted. Soldiers grabbed rifles, shouting orders, pointing. Caleb didn't wait. He sprinted down the slope toward the gun emplacement, zigzagging as bullets kicked up sand around his feet. Mara broke from cover and ran in the opposite direction, toward the ammunition bunker. The guards were confused, divided, trying to track 2 targets at once. That confusion bought them seconds. Caleb hit the beach running, his boots pounding against packed sand. A bullet whipped past his ear. Another punched through his sleeve without touching skin. He dove behind a stack of sandbags as a hail of gunfire tore into the barrier. Across the camp, he saw Mara reach the bunker. She touched the lit match to the oil-soaked cloth and threw it through the open door. Nothing happened. Then the world exploded. The ammunition inside the bunker ignited in a chain reaction. The explosion so massive it lifted the roof clean off. Fire and shrapnel sprayed in every direction. Soldiers were thrown like ragdolls, their screams lost in the roar. Caleb used the chaos to move. He sprinted toward the coastal gun, the massive weapon looming above him like a sleeping giant. The crew was scattered, some dead from the blast, others stumbling in shock. He reached the gun and climbed onto the platform, his hands finding the breach mechanism. It was different from the others, more complex, reinforced. He jammed the knife into the seam and twisted with all his strength. Nothing. He twisted harder, his muscles screaming. The blade bent but didn't break. Behind him, soldiers were recovering, turning toward the gun. Someone shouted in Japanese. Boots pounded against sand. Caleb abandoned the knife and grabbed a heavy wrench from the gun platform. He swung it like a baseball bat, slamming it into the breach mechanism over and over. Metal dented, components cracked. But it wasn't enough. A soldier appeared on the platform, rifle raised. Caleb swung the wrench and caught him across the jaw, sending him tumbling over the railing. Another came from the opposite side. Caleb tackled him, and they went down hard on the metal platform, grappling. The soldier was younger, stronger. He got on top, his hands closing around Caleb's throat. Caleb's vision began to blur, stars dancing at the edges. Then Mara was there, the hatchet flashing down. The soldier collapsed, and Mara pulled Caleb to his feet. "The breach!" Caleb gasped, pointing. Mara assessed it with a glance, then grabbed one of the massive artillery shells from the loading rack. "Help me!" Together they lifted the shell, it had to weigh 60 pounds, and shoved it backward into the breach mechanism at the wrong angle. Metal shrieked as components bent and jammed. "Again!" Mara shouted. They grabbed another shell and forced it in sideways. The entire mechanism buckled, gears stripping, seals rupturing. The gun was destroyed. But so were they if they didn't move. Soldiers surrounded the platform now, rifles aimed up at them from every direction. "There's no way out," Mara said, her voice oddly calm. Caleb looked around desperately. She was right. They were trapped on top of a gun platform with nowhere to go. The beach on one side, 50 armed soldiers on the other. Then he looked up. The massive barrel of the coastal gun pointed out toward the sea, toward the American fleet, toward rescue. "Mara," he said slowly, "how waterproof is that rope?" She followed his gaze and her eyes went wide. "You're insane." "Probably, but it's our only shot." They didn't have time to debate. Caleb grabbed the rope, tied one end around the barrel near the muzzle, and threw the other end over the side facing the ocean. "When I say go, we slide down and jump," he said quickly. "The drop is maybe 30 feet. We hit the water and swim for the rocks. And then what?" "Then we survive, like we always do." Mara looked at him, at this man who'd washed up on her island half dead and somehow convinced her that fighting was worth it, that hope was worth it. Then she grabbed the rope. "Together," she said. "Together." The soldiers below were climbing the platform now, seconds from reaching them. "Go!" Caleb shouted. They jumped over the railing and slid down the rope, their hands burning from friction. Bullets sparked off the gun barrel above them. Then they were falling, the ocean rushing up to meet them. Caleb hit the water hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. He went under, the cold shocking his system, and for a terrible moment he was back on the raft, drowning in the Pacific, everything ending where it began. But then Mara's hand found his, pulling him upward. They broke the surface together, gasping, and started swimming. Bullets churned the water around them, but in the darkness and confusion, the soldiers' aim was wild. Caleb and Mara reached the rocks at the base of the cliff and hauled themselves up, collapsing on the wet stone. Behind them, the coastal gun sat silent and broken, its barrel aimed at nothing. All 3 artillery pieces were destroyed. The island's teeth had been pulled. They didn't have long to rest. Soldiers would be coming around the cliff face any minute, and the ocean route was cut off by the ongoing naval battle. They climbed inland, their waterlogged clothes weighing them down, their bodies pushed beyond every limit. But as they crested a rise and looked back, they saw something that made Caleb's heart surge. The American fleet was advancing. With the coastal guns silent, destroyers and cruisers were moving into the bay, their searchlights sweeping the beach. Landing craft were being lowered, Marines readying for an amphibious assault. "They're coming," Mara breathed. "They're actually coming." "Not fast enough," Caleb said grimly, pointing down at the beach. The enemy soldiers were regrouping, digging in, preparing to defend the island. They had small arms, machine gun nests, mortars. The American landing would be bloody, unless someone could even the odds. Caleb's eyes fell on the ammunition bunker, or what was left of it. The initial explosion had been massive, but the structure hadn't completely collapsed, and through the smoke and rubble, he could see shapes inside, more ammunition, crates of it. If they could set that off during the landing, the explosion would devastate the enemy's defensive positions. "Mara," he said, "one more job." She followed his gaze and shook her head in disbelief. "That bunker is surrounded by enemy soldiers. We'll never reach it." "We don't have to reach it. We just have to shoot it." He pulled her toward the ridge where they'd first observed the camp, the place where this whole desperate gambit had started. There, cached in the rocks where Mara had hidden it months ago, was a rifle. Old, rusted, probably British colonial vintage. But it still worked. Mara had kept it as a last resort, a single bullet saved for the moment when survival meant taking a shot she couldn't afford to miss. This was that moment. Caleb lifted the rifle, checking the bolt action. The mechanism was stiff but functional. The single round in the chamber gleamed dully. "Can you make that shot?" Mara asked quietly. Caleb looked down at the bunker, calculating distance and wind. It had to be 400 yards, maybe more, in the dark, with a weapon he'd never fired before, hitting a target the size of a doorway. "I have no idea," he admitted. "Then let me." Caleb turned to her, surprised. Mara took the rifle from his hands, her movements confident and practiced. "My father was a hunter," she said, settling into a prone position and sighting down the barrel. "Taught me to shoot when I was 8. I hated it at first. All that waiting, all that patience." She adjusted her grip slightly. "But I got good at it eventually." Caleb crouched beside her, watching the beach. The first American landing craft were approaching the shore now, soldiers visible in their silhouettes. "Whenever you're ready," he said quietly. Mara's breathing slowed, steadied. Her finger rested gently on the trigger. For a long moment she was completely still, part of the rock beneath her. Then she fired. The rifle cracked, the recoil driving into her shoulder. For an endless second, nothing happened. Then the bunker exploded. The blast was even bigger than before, a rolling fireball that climbed into the night sky like a newborn sun. The shockwave flattened everything within 50 yards, tents, equipment, soldiers. The enemy defensive line simply ceased to exist, and the American Marines stormed ashore into minimal resistance. Caleb and Mara watched from the ridge as their countrymen swept across the beach, securing positions, raising the flag. The naval bombardment had stopped. The battle was over. The island had been liberated. Mara lowered the rifle slowly, her hands trembling. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Caleb pulled her close, and she didn't resist. They sat there together, two people who'd survived hell, watching the sun begin to rise over the Pacific. For the first time in months, the light felt warm instead of punishing. The Marines found them 3 hours later. Caleb and Mara were too exhausted to move anymore, sitting on the ridge like statues. When the patrol appeared through the jungle, rifles raised, Caleb just lifted his hand slowly and spoke in a hoarse voice. "Don't shoot! We're American!" The patrol leader, a hard-faced sergeant with 3 days of stubble, stared at them in disbelief. "Who the hell are you?" "Caleb Ward, Marine Raider, USS Langford," he gestured to Mara. "Mara Elridge, Army nurse, we're the ones who took out the coastal guns." The sergeant's expression shifted from suspicion to shock. "You two? Jesus Christ, we thought it was a commando team. How many of you are there?" "Just us," Mara said tiredly. The sergeant looked at them, at their torn clothes and scarred hands and eyes that had seen too much. Then he turned to his squad. "Get a medic up here. Now." Within minutes, they were surrounded by Marines being checked for injuries, given water and rations. Caleb's hands were bandaged. Mara's cuts were cleaned and dressed. Someone draped blankets over their shoulders. A young lieutenant approached, his expression a mix of awe and confusion. "Sir, ma'am, we need to debrief you. Command is going to want to know everything. How you survived, how you conducted operations against a superior force. Later, the sergeant interrupted. Let them rest first. They were taken to the beach where a field hospital had been set up. Doctors examined them, pronouncing them malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from various infections, but overall remarkably intact given the circumstances. Caleb sat on a cot in the medical tent, watching the organized chaos of the occupation. Marines secured the perimeter. Engineers assessed the damaged artillery positions. Radio operators coordinated with the fleet offshore. It felt surreal. For so long, the island had been just him and Mara against the world. Now it was full of people, noise, purpose. Mara appeared beside him, her own examination complete. She sat down without asking, and they watched the activity together in silence. What happens now? She asked finally. They'll evacuate us, Caleb said. Ship us back to a hospital, probably in Hawaii or Australia. Debrief us. Maybe pin a medal on us and call us heroes. We're not heroes. We were just trying to survive. Maybe that's what makes someone a hero. Choosing to survive when giving up would be easier. Mara smiled faintly. Is that what you think? Caleb looked at her, at this woman who'd taught him patience and resilience, who'd stood beside him when running would have been smarter. I think you're the bravest person I've ever met. Mara's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. You changed something in me, you know. When you washed up on that beach, I'd given up. I was just existing, waiting for the end. She paused. You reminded me what it felt like to fight, to hope. You saved my life more times than I can count, and you saved mine. She took his hand, her grip firm. We saved each other. They sat like that for a long while, hand in hand, as the sun climbed higher and the island transformed around them. The evacuation came 2 days later. Caleb and Mara were loaded onto a landing craft along with wounded Marines and escorted out to a destroyer waiting offshore. As the boat pulled away from the beach, Caleb looked back at the island one last time. It looked smaller now, less menacing, just a piece of rock and jungle, unremarkable except for what had happened there. But he knew he'd never forget it. The island had taken everything from him and given him something back he didn't know he needed: purpose, strength, and a companion who understood what it meant to survive the unsurvivable. Aboard the destroyer, they were given clean clothes, hot food, and real bunks. The luxury of it felt almost obscene after months of sleeping on dirt and eating whatever they could catch. A naval commander interviewed them separately, taking detailed notes about their actions on the island. When he asked how 2 people had managed to sabotage an enemy occupation and hold out for so long, Caleb didn't know how to answer. We just didn't quit, he said finally. That's all. The commander looked at him thoughtfully. The intelligence you provided, the damage you inflicted, the coastal guns you destroyed, you saved hundreds of lives, Ward. The fleet would have sailed right into that kill zone if those guns had been operational. You understand that? Caleb did understand, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival, which was all it had ever been. When the interview was over, he found Mara on deck, leaning against the railing and watching the island shrink into the distance. They're recommending us for commendations, Caleb said, joining her. I don't want a medal, Mara said quietly. I want to forget any of this happened. Will you? Forget? She turned to look at him, and he saw the truth in her eyes. No, neither will you. She was right. The island would be with them forever, a ghost they'd carry in their bones. What will you do? Caleb asked. After this? Mara was quiet for a long time. Go back to nursing, I think, but somewhere quiet. Somewhere far from the war. She glanced at him. You? Caleb thought about it. A month ago, he would have said he'd go back to his unit, back to fighting, because that was all he knew. But the island had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. I don't know, he admitted. Figure it out as I go, I guess. Mara smiled. That sounds about right. They stood together at the railing as the destroyer cut through the waves, carrying them toward civilization, toward whatever came next. The island disappeared completely over the horizon, and with it, the war they'd fought alone. 3 weeks later, Caleb stood on the dock in Pearl Harbor, watching the ships come and go. He'd been cleared by medical, debriefed by intelligence, and given 30 days leave. They'd offered him a new assignment, a training position stateside where he could teach survival tactics to new recruits. He'd accepted because he didn't know what else to do. But first, he'd made a promise. Mara appeared beside him, carrying a small duffel bag. She'd been assigned to a hospital in San Francisco, back to the work she'd done before the war found her. "Ready?" she asked. "Yeah." They walked together through the crowded dock, past sailors and Marines and civilians, two people who'd shared something no one else could understand. At the gate, they stopped. "This is where I catch my transport," Mara said. Caleb nodded. He'd known this moment was coming, but it still felt like losing something important. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Mara smiled, a real smile, the kind he'd only seen a few times on the island. "Thank you for not letting me give up." She stepped forward and kissed him on the cheek, gentle and brief. Then she stepped back. "Take care of yourself, Caleb Ward." "You too, Mara Elridge." She turned and walked toward the waiting truck, her back straight, her stride confident. Caleb watched her go, this woman who'd been his partner, his teacher, his anchor in the storm. At the truck, she paused and looked back one last time. Their eyes met across the crowded dock, and an understanding passed between them that needed no words. They'd survived. They'd fought. They'd won. And now they had to learn how to live again. Mara climbed into the truck, and it pulled away, disappearing into the flow of military traffic. Caleb stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything they'd endured settle on his shoulders. But it wasn't a crushing weight anymore. It was a foundation. The island had tried to break him, but instead it had rebuilt him into something stronger, something capable of facing whatever came next, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Caleb turned and walked back toward the base, toward his future, carrying the island with him. Not as a burden, but as proof that even in the darkest moments, even when survival seemed impossible, the human spirit could endure. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes survival was the victory. The ocean stretched out behind him, endless and indifferent, hiding the island somewhere beyond the horizon. But Caleb Ward didn't look back. He'd spent enough time fighting the past. Now, finally, he could face forward and live.